Hello, everybody. My name is Spencer Walsh. Welcome to today's show. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We have a great one for you, as always. We got a very interesting, kind of a historical story to start off with today, and it is the passing of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, adopting the principles of glasnost and perestroika. He weighed the legacy of 7 decades of communist rule and set a new course. We'll take a look at his legacy and where it stands now in Russia. The good, ending some of the downsides, obviously, that we saw in the Soviet Union, some of the worst kind of repression. But we also have to take into account the tremendous suffering that his policies brought on as the Soviet Union came to an end. I think there's really no doubt about that. But meanwhile, we'll take a look at student debt in the military. The U.S. military has had a pretty long history of recruiting poor people by offering benefits such as free college. How student debt and the movement to make college more affordable threatens that. A very successful rent strike in Oakland we're going to be talking about. Some really interesting structural gains to the system there made as well. And for our last story, will they coup Lula? Lula da Silva, the left-wing president, is leading in the polls in the biggest country in South America. I believe the 7th biggest economy in the world. Will he make it? Will he get elected successfully, or will Jair Bolsonaro and the right try and coup him? We'll discuss that last on the show. All right, so we start off with this big news today in the passing of Mikhail Gorbachev. Here's what the New York Times had to say about him. He rose to power in the Soviet Union, and it set in motion a series of revolutionary changes that transformed the map of Europe and ended the Cold War that had threatened the world with nuclear annihilation. He passed away, Mikhail Gorbachev, in Moscow at the age of 91. His death was announced on Tuesday by Russia's state news agency, citing the city central clinical hospital. The reports said he had died after an unspecified long and grave illness. Few leaders in the 20th century, indeed at any time in any century, have had such a profound effect on their time. And really the biggest thing when you look at, the legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev, which was pretty much ending the Cold War almost completely on the terms of the West. And that is why he is so, well respected by the Russian dissident community, people who have come to this country, come to the West, come to Europe, from Soviet Russia, not necessarily from what happened after. At home, he promised and delivered greater openness as he set to restructure the country's society and faltering economy. Really, one thing he did was just really open the culture of the Soviet Union to the world in a way that hadn't really been before, and just really this moment in time, what Mikhail Gorbachev was able to do. More than anyone, because people like George H.W. Bush, they couldn't do it without somebody like him who was pretty much really ready to say, we'll try and build NATO. We're going to be there. We want to be a part of the West rather than liberalize our pole of the world. As it was a bipolar world now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, thanks to Gorbachev, it became a unipolar world. And it really was kind of a remarkable, liberalization. And that brought about a lot of things. Of course, it brought, liberalization of culture, huge amount of access that these former Soviet socialist republics had to not just, their fellow Soviet socialist republics, but, to the world's tons of, modernization. He and the Soviet debacle in Afghanistan and an extraordinary 5 months in 1989 stood by as the communist system imploded from the Baltics to the Balkans and countries already weakened by widespread corruption and moribund economies. For this, he was hounded from office by hardline communists and disappointed liberals alike, the first group fearing that he would destroy the old system, and others worried he would not. Abroad, he was hailed as heroic. But to many inside Russia, here's I think the important part that we have to understand. The upheaval Gorbachev had wrought was a disaster. President Vladimir Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. For Putin and his fellow KGB veterans, who now form the inner circle of power in Russia, the end of the USSR was a moment of shame and defeat that the invasion of Ukraine this year was help to undo. I think it's important just to look up the kind of New York Times perspective on this, and look at what they are telling you here, because I do want to provide you a little bit of extra context as to what it was. It wasn't just really a moment of shame for these KGB veterans, these people who had really, like Putin, who had really just risen to power throughout all these different times and had to whatever leader was in charge just claw their way through every single meeting, every single interaction with fellow government officials. A really, really tough, backstabby type of place to be. What Gorbachev presided over it was the complete and utter privatization of every single thing in Russia, where what was the Soviet Union was pretty much bought and stripped for parts in what was a really kind of horrific way. Gorbachev made no public statement of his own about the war in Ukraine. Through his foundation in February 26th, he just called for a speedy cessation of hostilities. A friend of his, though, the radio journalist Alexei Vendikov, said in a July interview Gorbachev was upset about the war, viewing it as having undermined his life's work. When he came to power, Gorbachev was a loyal son of the Communist Party, but he had come to see things with new eyes. "We cannot live this way any longer," he told Eduard A. Shevardnadze, who would become his most trusted foreign minister in 1984. Within 5 years, he had overturned much that the party held at times inviolable. And, the West, capitalism, pretty much flooded in and left really what was a pretty devastated country behind. Russia's GDP dropped by 40%, real wages halved, poverty ballooned from 2.2 million in 1987 to 88 to 66 million. 66, I'll repeat that, 2.2 to 66 million from 1987 to 88 to 93 to 95. Millions died under the brutal regime of privatization and shock therapy. 500,000 women were trafficked into sexual slavery. It was a pretty brutal time if you were, someone other than the few oligarchs who benefited tremendously from that privatization, or the tons of, American businesses who finally got a brand new market in the former Soviet Union to come and go in and work through. Mikhail Gorbachev was really the only guy who could look at the desolation and the suffering caused by the moribund, corrupt, completely just sucked out, lifeless form of the Soviet Union, what it was at the very end, and say, we can do a little bit better than that. Hold my pizza. Let's see what we got. Just really that is devastating. And, if you want to see why someone like Putin, who can grow up through the Russian political system and come together and put forth a relatively popular message like we need to regain Russian glory after the failures of someone like Mikhail Gorbachev, that is why. This is the greatest collapse in living standards, united living standards, for a massive, massive part of the world, frankly, in human history. That's just a fact. There's plenty of critiques that I have made and will continue to make about the Soviet Union and all the things that came before. Look at the brutality of Stalin and the just lack of any kind of political liberty, political expression that took place, in large parts of the Soviet Union history. But you cannot be honest with yourself, I think, as someone who's not just looking at, history, but just, someone who cares about human suffering, and say that, the introduction of capitalism into the Soviet Union, or what was the Soviet Union, went smoothly for its people. A man of openness, vision, and great vitality. He looked at the legacy of 7 decades of communist rule, saw corruption, a labor force lacking motivation and discipline, factories that produced shoddy goods, and a distribution system that guaranteed consumers a little bit empty shelves, empty of just about everything but vodka. So that there are these kind of facts. There's these kind of pictures being painted, and really a remembrance from people like George H.W. Bush, people who were across the table at the time of intense and really welcome cultural liberalization. But on the terms of the economic side, it was a complete and utter buyout of everything of the Soviet Union, and they really left nothing behind for a lot of people. And he really became the figure of the West. He became the figure of capitalism. He became pretty much the Soviet premier who bent almost in a way. And that is it's a very remarkable situation. Boris Yeltsin obviously has, he and Yeltsin kind of went hand in hand. So that, I think that's certainly something to be, he pretty much carried out the process that Yeltsin started and helps a lot, Yeltsin finished, Gorbachev. It was Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and then Putin. But, I think the key thing is to say that Gorbachev started that process and really got the ball rolling through what was a brutal 90s for the former people, I would say, of the Soviet Union. So that is, I think, there's going to be a huge amount of recognition of, I think, very liberalization. The cultural liberalization, I think, and that's something to be completely celebrated. But, there is, I think, what I always at least try to do here on Newsflash is tell you the sides of the stories that are being told less and less. So you're going to hear a lot in the media about, oh, he did this, he did, and some really amazing things. He brought the Russian people into Western culture, into the Western world, for the first time in many, many years, obviously. But you cannot, you got to take the good with the bad. It's a black and white, it's not a black and white picture, it's a lot of gray. And I think you got to look at the economic side and say, the amount of human suffering that was there cannot be ignored. But, if you look at, sadly, a lot of the mainstream media, they will ignore it. My name is Spencer Walsh. This is the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, and if you're listening to one of our podcasts, whether it's Newsflash, Hidden History, The Spencer Walsh Show, or something else, ladies and gentlemen, we have one simple request of you. Please be sure to rate us, subscribe to us if you like us, and leave us a comment, because just like all of you, sometimes we need that feedback in our lives, good or bad. We want to hear what you have to say. So please do those steps. Make SWR and content better. And thank you so much for listening. Really interesting situation here, as we were seeing some pretty interesting clips and tweets coming out of Georgia at the moment, with Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker is obviously running for Senate, and Walker is ahead now, apparently ahead in the polls, 49-5. Herschel Walker polling ahead of Raphael Warnock. Warnock, the main swing state senator, supportive of the Biden plan. Walker is apparently holding a 2-point lead. A 2-point lead now. That has dropped. Sorry, the lead has gotten smaller. The Republican Walker's lead over Raphael Warnock in the wake of the student debt release. It was about halved from about 4 points to 2 points. But meanwhile, we're getting clips like this. This is Herschel Walker earlier on Newsmax, and this is what he is sounding like. And folks, it is not good.
People know what I stand for. Herschel Walker is still standing. My bike is not bent, so anyone can ride my bike. Like he seemed to have Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden riding his bike, because he seemed to be voting for whatever they say. People know what I stand for.
Yeah, so that Herschel Walker talking about someone is apparently riding, I guess, Raphael Warnock's bike. I don't know if that makes any sense. Is Herschel riding his own bike? I don't even really know. It's a very disturbing situation there. So just some things kind of coming across the wire. Want to keep you up on. A pretty important thing I'm pretty sure Herschel Walker cares a lot about is the military. And it has been a rough year for them, especially on the recruitment front. Amid a brutal year here for military recruiting, conservative warhawks are openly fretting that President Joe Biden's announcement of a last week of a one-time means-tested student debt cancellation will undercut the military's ability to prey on desperate young Americans. Student loan forgiveness undermines one of our military's greatest recruitment tools at a time of dangerously low enlistments. House Representative Jim Banks, U.S. House Representative Jim Banks, tweeted shortly after the announcement. So, yeah, pretty much this guy is saying, yeah, we make college more affordable. Sorry, you guys won't be able to sign up to go kill yourselves somewhere, across the world now. Too bad. This is a big crisis. National security. So, in the 6 years since Banks first ran for Congress, this guy has taken more than $400,000 from defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and other major players in the military-industrial complex. Corporate political action committees for Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, L3 Harris Technologies, and Ultra Electronics have each donated tens of thousands of dollars to Banks, according to Federal Election Committee data analyzed by Open Secrets. He now sits on the House Armed Conservatives Committee, which oversees the Defense Department and the United States military. Members of this committee have already collected more than $3.4 million from defense contractors and weapons manufacturers this election cycle. So, if you wonder why these systems in our country are so broken, this is why. Like, this stuff is out there right in front of you, and you have them saying it. You know what their priorities are, because they are pretty much coming out there and saying what their priorities are, frankly, in a very accurate and very transparent, up there, forward-facing way. He is saying that not only is he going to not fight for you because he's probably to go to college, more efficiently. He won't do it because he's being paid by for it by these military companies, these defense companies, quote unquote, who thrive off of more war. So is he going to vote to stop war? No. Is he going to vote to fix the college system? No, because he's being paid by these special interests, literally legalized bribery. And with that being said, it's not. So if you want to understand really why the fight to change something really systemic about college is so complex, or really anything for that matter, because you got all these different representatives being paid by all these different interests to do different things. So it's not really, if you're talking about making college more affordable, you got to worry about not just the banks, not just the credit card industry, because they may be controlling, say, a senator like, I don't know, Joe Biden, the senator from MPNA, who literally made student debt the only type you could not discharge even after death. Even after death, Joe Biden did that. The senator from MBNA, he built that problem, and I guarantee you there was tons of other guys with tons of other interests in the Senate and in the House at the time with all huge incentives to stop this kind of change, to stop anything like this from happening. That is why they're there, and that is why all this money flows in such a way. So Banks' admission highlights the way student debt crisis has been exploited by the military-industrial complex. By saying the quiet part out loud, Banks is finally speaking the truth about how military recruiters use the GI Bill, the 1944 law that awards a robust benefit package to veterans, as a remedy for the cost of higher education to convince younger people to enlist. Mike Preisner knows something about this. To have members of Congress openly imply that the answer to actually exacerbate is to the answer to this is to actually exacerbate hardship for the poor and working class youth is actually the best thing for young Americans to see. Because at least now, for the first time ever, they are being open about it. Say, hey, you can't have a future. You can't go to college. Normally, it is bad for a certain type of American, a certain geographical or socioeconomic status, to go and do that, to go to college, because it's going to be a threat to national security. Because we have, as the military, relied on this system. We have relied on structuring our economy around constantly expanding our reach across the globe militarily, backed up by a thrumming kind of engine of industry at home. And for that, we need these young kind of working class kids who don't have any other future and need to kind of go out there on the front lines and just serve, towards the end of things. I think that is going to, the front line wherever that may be, at any time, and if we don't have that, that is a threat to our national security. And these people, certain people, they can't have a future. We're already getting low in enlistments, guys. It's getting scary out here. We're in real trouble. Yeah, it really is quite a ridiculous situation if it wasn't so real for so many people. All right. we're going to move on now to our next story. Pretty cool situation in Oakland. When Maria Montes de Osa and her family moved into their apartment, this is in Jacobin here, in their Fruitvale neighborhood of Oakland 14 years ago, they already had problems. Their apartment clearly had not been maintained. The carpet was stained and damaged, and neither the stove nor the fridge worked. Later on, there was cockroach infestation and mold issues. When Maria tried to get her landlord, Calvin Wong, to carry out repairs or fumigate, he would ignore her request or tell her he'd use her security deposit to pay for it, a practice that's illegal in California. Yet, in spite of mounting maintenance and habitability issues, the rent kept going up. Maria's 14-unit building wasn't protected by rent control as a result of the California Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which precludes certain units being subject to municipal rent ordinances. In Oakland, this includes apartments built after 1980. In 2016, after carrying out structural repairs to the building while ignoring tenants' complaints, Wong raised the monthly net rent by $500. This was a 50% increase from Maria, an unthinkable amount. That's when she began talking with the neighbors and discovered they were facing similar issues. After reaching out to a legal center, their tenants were connected to an Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, ACCE, a statewide grassroots organization that supports and organizes tenants locally. We were told about the rent hikes, about the conditions of the apartment, and about our concerns, and ACCE taught us about how to organize among ourselves in the ways we could fight back against this kind of situation, Maria told Jacobin in Spanish. The tenants began holding various meetings, sending out written requests, and carrying out various actions. Eventually, they engaged the Oakland Community Land Trust, Oak CLT, which focuses on preserving and expanding affordability in Oakland's low-income areas. Founded in the wake of the foreclosure crisis, Oak CLT works closely with ACCE and has a track record of purchasing both vacant and tenant-occupied properties, removing them from the speculative market and placing them under community control. But when Oak CLT, with the tenant support, reached out to the landlord to inquire about his interest in selling the building late 2018 and again in 2019, they were rebuffed. So people like these landlords, they like it. They just like having property that they can make complete profit off of. Not surprised, but when it comes to, you're having, I don't know, maybe less than 100, maybe around 100, however many families, whatever. However many families, however many people are in that building, you are profiting off of their misery, like literally directly, completely directly. I think that is a completely fair way of putting it. Because, this is going to cause not just health problems for them, health problems for their kids. It's going to make their lives so much worse. And all while you make fat profits just by sitting on your couch. The situation of Fruitvale tenants found themselves facing an exploitative landlord seeking to squeeze profits through continuous rent increases, legislative loopholes, and maintenance neglect is emblematic of the state of the tenant-landlord relationship in cities across the United States. As a result of financialization, gentrification, and the rollback of tenant protections, housing has been thoroughly commodified. The use of a place to live subordinate to the potential for maximum profit. The use value of a place to live subordinate to the potential for maximum profit. With the rents that continue to soar to historic heights, combined with the decades of wage stagnation and more recently rampant inflation, tenants are increasingly facing displacement at the hands of their landlords, be they corporate or so-called mom and pop landlords. The narrative about these mom and pop landlords who just own a few buildings or units and depend on tenant income for their livelihood have been promoted by the real estate lobby for years, particularly during the pandemic, to argue that renters' protections like eviction moratoria or rent control were wrong. Grace Martinez, director of ACCE, told Jacobin, you have these large landlords and this entire industry using that narrative about the poor grandma and grandpa, these small landlords. But really, it's grandma and grandpa evicting and terrorizing other grandmas and grandpas. So what exactly is more valuable? Is it someone's investment or is it someone's ability to live and be sheltered? So, really a true thing. It's just about, if you have a grandma and grandpa that just ended up making it rich, they're, most likely white, they're going to be exploiting, especially in a city like Oakland, a bunch of minority people, and they're most likely going to be people with kids and older people who are in a very tough situation. For the Fruitvale tenants, lack of control was a sticking point. In addition to their frustration with their apartment's disrepair, many worried about being displaced by consistent rent hikes. So when 9 of the tenants initiated their rent strike, they wanted to force their landlord to the negotiating table with the hope of eliminating him from the equation altogether, decommodifying their homes and ensuring tenant control in the process. When the rent strike began in late 2019, the Fruitvale tenants demanded the landlord either carry out much-needed repairs or sell the building to Oaks TLT. They intensified their pressure through TV and radio interviews and by reaching out to tenants from other buildings owned by their landlord, showing up at his home and business, and holding a Halloween-themed protest. In response, the landlord hounded tenants via text and letters placed under and on tenants' doors, demanding they pay their mounting rent debt or, quote-unquote, face the consequences, i.e. eviction, while taking punitive measures like denying Maria access to the building's washing facilities when her apartment was infested with cockroaches. I think the only real cockroach is the one that owns the place. Am I right? Anyway, 4 months into the rent strike, having rejected their initial offers, Calvin Wong caved and agreed to meet with Oaks TLT in February 2020 to discuss a possible sale. When the pandemic hit a month later, negotiations fizzled. The tenants, though, continued their rent strike, now with the protection of the COVID-19 eviction moratorium. Nevertheless, Wong raised the rent by additional $100 a month in the middle of a global pandemic, and later tried to pressure the tenants to apply for rental assistance through the rent relief program. Maria described a heated exchange in which the landlord came to her door, and her daughter, who was translating for Maria, grew fearful the landlord would get physical with them. I kept telling him we're not going to apply. He said, either you do the repairs or we're going to keep the strike going. So really just incredible situation. Them all, in power, that whole building, really making that guy Calvin Wong look pretty small. Even with the eviction moratorium in place, some of the Fruitvale families moved out, fearing displacement was inevitable. Others lost hope and ended their participation in the strike. For the families who stayed and watched their rent debt grow month after month, the pressure took a toll. Jesus Alvarez, who moved in 18 years ago with his wife and 2 children, said in Spanish, "It was a really hard time." He said, "I was worried for my family because if we didn't reach our goal, we didn't know what would happen. It was hard to fall asleep at night because the worrying was constant. It wasn't good for my health." In mid-2021, with the tenants nearly 2 years into the rent strike, Oaks TLT submitted a letter of intent and re-engaged Calvin Wong about a possible sale. Calvin Wong and Oaks TLT spent much of the year negotiating the deal, and in December 2021, just as the tenants were preparing for a Las Posadas-themed protest, reenacting the Mary and Joseph search for shelter, they learned that Wong had agreed to sell, turning their protest into a celebration. A huge win there. And I think that's a really cool way of doing it with this Oaks TLT trust, purchasing the building through $3.3 million using municipal bond funds from Oakland's Measure KK, an infrastructure bond passed in 2016. The use of municipal infrastructure bonds funds the decommodification of housing, indicates an emerging commitment to the preservation of affordability, as well as recognition that homes and existing tenants of those homes are part of the city's critical infrastructure, testament to years of hard work put in by tenants and organizers. Although funding available under Measure KK has run out, ACC and other organizers are campaigning for another housing and infrastructure bond measure that will be on the ballot in November and is going to be absolutely crucial in making things like this, stories like this, a reality. So that's a really cool way of doing it, just kind of going around a federal system, just doing it through bond funding, having the way to buy out houses from these really awful, exploitative, profit-seeking landlords, and, bringing prices down, creating a market that just, even one, helps the market in general. So I think it's really, really cool to see, no matter what. So with that being said, time to move on to our next story in just a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to News Flash. Get a good last story for you. Very, very excited because it's interesting. We're talking about we got I don't know, which is a month or so, till this very exciting, brand new, or not brand new, but obviously, but, first time in 5 years, I believe it is, they will vote in Brazil for a new president. Former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, currently behind the polls, is confronting an increasingly delirious incumbent who appears to have threatened unconstitutional action should he lose. It's actually been 4 years of Jair Bolsonaro, president, right-winger, Amazon forest burner, absolutely just racist, awful person, completely. So Bolsonaro's victory came 2 years after the impeachment of Workers' Party President Dilma Rousseff, the first woman to be president in 2016. The Workers' Party had held office since 2003. The period of 2010 through 16 was dominated by the credit crisis, which sent the world into turmoil, with the generalized economic contraction and huge indebtedness in the advanced economies and a considerable reduction in the consumption of raw materials. Brazil was badly hit. In 2015, the GDP had declined by 3%. Inflation was high. The public debt went through the roof to 63% of the GDP, making it tough for the government to maintain its poverty eradication social policies. Brazil's right wing had capitalized on the crisis. A reactionary Movimento Brasil Livre unleashed a wave of street protests that also fed on the Lava Jato investigation on corruption in Petrobras, the largest state oil company, one of the largest in the world. This allowed Brazil's right to create an atmosphere of instability. This, again, here reporting in Jacobin on this. They've been great throughout. This allowed Brazil's right to create an atmosphere of instability in which they would use both to impeach Dilma by a parliamentary vote on false charges of cooking the books, and to launch an anti-PT witch hunt, to which the global media really contributed massively, and daily Brazil's media was much worse. The interim government, though, of Michel Temer, riding on this intoxicating campaign, took steps to reverse the PT's social policies, freezing state spending on health and education for 20 years. What MBL began would not be complete without removing Lula as a potential candidate for 2018, because he can run again. We talked about this whole situation, by the way, in detail a few years back. It is still up. Scroll way down. So we're even started counting episodes. So do 2-part series, I believe, on the Lava Jato investigation. So Judge Sergio Moro in 2018 was entrusted to conduct an investigation seeking to convict Lula on charges of corruption. So Moro achieved this after 4 years, leading to the former president's legal imprisonment for 580 days, first as arrest, followed by a 9-year prison sentence in 2017, then increased to 12 years in 2018 when Lula appealed. Moro deployed every dirty trick in lawfare arsenal to jail Lula, which he enjoyed full support of not just Brazil's establishment, but the world mainstream media as well. Meanwhile, Fernando Haddad, the PT presidential candidate who replaced Lula, had barely 3 weeks to fight the 2018 election. The generalized anti-PT climate created after Dilma's impeachment and Lula's imprisonment allowed the pro-Bolsonaro businessmen to break all election norms and pay millions of dollars to inundate social media with fake news portraying Haddad as a perverted monster, recommending really just some crazy conservative kind of culture war stuff, portraying Haddad as a perverted monster, recommending the distribution of penis-shaped baby bottles to babies out there, and teaching homosexuality in schools, all that stuff. But Bolsonaro won in the second round with 55% of the vote. So not a complete blowout, but Bolsonaro is someone who's unashamedly racist, misogynistic, and homophobic. He has repeatedly insulted and denigrated women, the LGBTQ community, Black and indigenous Brazilians. He openly supports the 1964 to 85 military dictatorship and dedicated his speech in support of Dilma's impeachment to Colonel Carlos Brilhante Ustra, who back in 1970 commanded her torture. Dilma's actually, we talked about her in those episodes. It's a pretty cool story, actually. She was a hardcore union activist in the dictatorship who was actually tortured by that same guy. And when she was impeached, Bolsonaro gave him a shout out, and now it looks like it's all about to come full circle this Sunday. Bolsonaro, by the way, he also described COVID-19 as a little flu and seemed to pretty much get it maybe 4 or 5 times, but unfortunately, still on the ballot. That's all I'm going to say. But by let's take a look at the economic record here of Bolsonaro. Spending on health and has fallen obviously drastically, along with spending on education. Between 2019 and 2021, state expenditure aimed at women fell 46%, and Bolsonaro has dismantled labor protections, frozen the minimum wage, and privatized the state's electricity company, which generates 30% of the country's energy, as a prelude to the privatization of Petrobras, which is, I believe, the state's oil company. More than 100 state energy assets have also been privatized. Under Bolsonaro's watch, the deforestation of Brazil's Amazon reached a record high in the first half of 2022, 1,500 square miles, 80% larger than the same period in 2018. And by mid-2022, it was estimated that 32 million Brazilians were suffering from hunger, just a state of mass suffering, and a huge decline in living standards there since the PT government. By the way, during that government, 30 million Brazilians lived out of poverty. 2015 real wages were 78% higher than the accumulated inflation since 2002. Over 90% of beneficiaries from the Poverty Eradication Bolsa Familia program were women, 68% of those being black women, and unemployment fell to less than 6%, the lowest level in history. 214 technical schools and 18 universities were created by the state, with free education at all levels made available to millions of students, many of whom were given scholarships. 51% of those were women. Bolsonaro's disastrous mismanagement led to his approval falling sharply below 20% in November 2021, compounded by having to face a presidential contest against a greatly strengthened Lula, who was fully exonerated in 2021 by the Supreme Court. So this latest data full hub poll shows 47% for Lula and 32% for Bolsonaro. In response, Bolsonaro and his supporters have really gone berserk in a pretty scary way. The thing with them is they have had pretty deep ties actually to Brazilian organized right-wing militias. So Marcelo Arruda, a PT local leader, was murdered and shot 3 times by a Bolsonaro supporter during his 50th birthday party in July 10th. PT election rally in Rio de Janeiro was also interrupted by the explosion of a homemade bomb. Since then, Lula has had to wear a bulletproof vest. Brazil has a long history of left-wing politicians pretty much getting shot on the street. Bolsonaro has also issued a dozen decrees in favor of Brazilians' right to bear arms, leading to a boom in gun ownership. He said that Brazil's electronic voting system is not reliable and has threatened to not recognize the results or cede power if he loses, hinting at a Brazilian storming of the Capitol a la Trump. One can only imagine what he will do if Lula does not win in the first round. The stakes are pretty high. Bolsonaro represents a grave threat to Brazil's already battered and bruised democracy. Prominent figures in politics, business, science, and law and the arts have issued a citizens' manifesto to defend the rule of law and oppose his authoritarian delirium. Private associations like the Brazil Federation of Banks and the main trade union federations signing declarations to really keep an eye on this and really go hard. In Britain, parliamentarians have signed a special motion denouncing Bolsonaro's election threats and political violence. And this is going to be a really, it's not like, will they or won't they? It's just going to be a January 6th thing, no big deal. No, this is a very serious situation. Definitely something worth watching in just about a month's time as Brazil has the polls. All right, that's all the time we got for you guys today. We will be back tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been Newsflash.